Hello, everyone, and welcome to 12 Practical Tips to Grow Your Privacy Career. With our three panelists today, I am quite sure that you're going to hear a lot more than just 12 tips. I'm Karen Howe with Ethos Privacy, also known as Sentinel. We're a leading privacy consulting and technology company based in the Pacific Northwest. As you have questions, please just post them in the chat and we'll deal with them as quickly as we can. And as far as getting started with the webinar, which I think is very important at this time, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for the panel this morning, Aaron Muller. Aaron is president and co-founder of Sentinel. Before coming to Sentinel, he was a managing director at PwC, specializing in data privacy and protection. Prior to PwC, he co-founded Concise Consulting, where he worked with Fortune 250 to build up their privacy programs. Aaron is a frequent speaker at conferences and an active member of the IAPP and has taught their certification classes for over 7 years. Aaron, take it away.
Thanks, Karen. Maybe we can get started before we get into the questions by having Chuck and Marc just introduce themselves and their background as well. I think one of the reasons that I'm excited about the conversation today is that all of us, and like a lot of our colleagues in privacy, we've come into this from very different angles. So maybe Marc, if you'd like to go first and kind of give a little bit of your background, and then we'll move to Chuck.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Aaron. My path into privacy has been an interesting one. I began my career in Silicon Valley startups during the first .com boom. I was a member of the technical support staff, and ultimately became a manager there prior to the .com bust. And then I had moved into program management, joining post my MBA, and then sort of evolved into a business analyst at a large ticketing company in San Francisco. From there, I sort of began my compliance role. They needed a compliance person, quote unquote. And eventually founded both the compliance and privacy programs at this company. And also I sort of dabbled in business continuity and disaster recovery. So I guess you could say I'm a jack of all trades. And then over time, I grew the privacy program, compliance, and now I'm at a Facebook, a large social media company, working as a program manager. So that's sort of my path in a nutshell, spanning a little more than a decade.
Great, thanks, Marc.
More than 2 decades, yeah.
Chuck, could you give us a little bit of kind of how you got to where you are today?
Sure. So I started in telecommunications law in around 1990, and at the time, one of the interesting things that was happening was the development of new wireless services. So my experience in wireless goes back quite a bit. It was about 10 years into that work as a regulatory lawyer, government affairs professional in wireless that we started to get your internet experiences on your mobile phone. And we started to think about, wow, we know a lot of data about what people are doing and where they're visiting. And we always had, some concerns about data about who you're calling and things like that, but it became, pretty clear to the company that there needed to be some work done on privacy. So I worked for a company called Vodafone at the time. I actually started a dialogue on what should our regulatory and self-regulatory really approach to privacy be. So from there, I worked at a variety of other companies. I worked at Microsoft for a bit, 7 years. Primarily, the skill sets that I have, focused on developing over the time are legal skill sets, reading legislation, regulations, figuring out how companies can apply those. The other skill set is stakeholder engagement. I think this will be apparent as we go through this conversation that, if you want a privacy program in a company, you need to have a variety of stakeholders engaged. And so I've done a good bit of work internally and externally with stakeholders. And then I think sort of one of the third component is a modest amount of technical knowledge. I have not ever been a member of a technical staff, nor would I ever be confused for one. But I think I've worked in FCC world. I worked in on the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which had a fair amount of engagement with how the phone network works. I can remember, advising clients in the early 90s about this new Al Gore legislation that seemed like it might be vaguely important. And so we got to learn a bit about how computers talk to each other. All of that, the technical knowledge that I've acquired, I think is also super important. So my career path has essentially been one from a combination of government affairs and public policy work into compliance roles, and then back and forth between that a little bit. But those three, I think, really the core of what my evolution has been. Modest but meaningful technical knowledge, stakeholdering, and then basic lawyering.
So super interesting. I mean, Chuck, I've known you for a number of years, and some of that is news to me about the some of the things that you've done in your past. Would you say that you think that you chose privacy as a profession, or do you think that it kind of chose you as you said, as things evolved and kind of, that there was a role where they needed, someone to be filling that, and you thought that that might be a good next step?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the latter. I mean, certainly it's a fascinating topic. I have a personal interest in it. I was a philosophy major, and there's a great deal of one that can apply from philosophy and ethics into privacy. So in a sense, I gravitated to it as a matter of interest. But another thing that was notable, and I think is important to watch, is what is the job market doing? What are industry trends doing? Coincidentally, the 96 Act introduced competition into local telephony and into long distance telephone had already been fairly competitive. It introduced competition in the video market. So all of the lawyers who had expertise in the structures by which the government regulated monopolies found themselves at a bit of loose ends once the government took apart those structures for regulating monopoly and substituted market competition.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I can think of a handful of folks who were telecom regulatory experts who then found their way into whatever the next thing available was, and it was privacy.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting how some of the external factors then influence what's even available. One of the things that I often say to when I lecture at the University of Washington, I say to the students there that the job that they're doing in 10 years may not even exist yet, because certainly the job that I do now didn't exist when I graduated. So I think that's one of the things that we really want to emphasize on this in this discussion is that that there are a lot of paths into privacy. And Marc, maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of how. So I'll pose the same question to you that I asked Chuck. So did you find privacy, or did privacy find you?
Well, that's actually a really interesting question. I think privacy found me. I was at StubHub working on compliance issues, working on the PCI side, working on security. And an interesting thing came in. I was pulled into an office, and it was our CIO saying, "We have this new thing called GDPR coming in Europe, and it sounds like a compliance issue. So here you go." So it sort of chose me in that manner. For me, it was an interesting challenge, not having that sort of background. So for me, it was grounds up. Go into the books, go into the internet. What is this? Start reading things about it. And what I found, it was sort of an interesting split between, there's a security issue, there's a technical component, and then there's a new component about the legal aspects of what privacy is and what it should be. And then sort of trying to apply that into my existing knowledge at the company. And where does this fit? How can I build this program up? This deadline is coming. So in that respect, privacy actually chose me, and I just sort of ran with it from that point on. So it was sort of being thrown to the wolves, I guess you could say. So that was my start.
So it sounds like you were looking for those available materials. One of the things that people often ask me is kind of how do I really understand? There's so many things to understand in privacy. Like, did you feel you had a mentor that really helped you kind of work out what you needed to what you needed to really know, or was it more self-taught in that you looked at the resources that were available to you and kind of just did the best?
For me, I didn't really have a mentor. I had worked with a number of our legal partners at my company, read it up online, worked with a couple privacy consultants. And that's sort of how I gained my knowledge. It was all self-taught. And for me, that's sort of the way I learned anyways. So that's how I, prepared myself. And it's sort of, for me, it's a constant learning experience as I move through my privacy career and jumping into new companies. So there's so many different aspects and so many different angles that you can, delve into. And it's almost like going down a rabbit hole, different types of legislations, different types of technologies. How does this apply to what scenario? And so that's how I've sort of discovered privacy and sort of my career.
And Chuck, from your perspective, you've come into privacy from, as you mentioned, kind of the government relations regulatory side of things. Did you have a mentor, or kind of what was your experience of really, starting to get that knowledge and thinking through, when you didn't know something or you kind of needed help, where did you turn to?
Yeah, it is interesting. I think in different contexts, I did and did not have mentors. As I mentioned, at Vodafone, we were really at the cutting edge of things. And in fact, it was in Japan where the first camera phones started, and the first, they called WAP phones, wireless access protocol phones, where you could use your phone and your pager for sports scores and things like that. And in that context, there was definitely a bit of a, wow, okay, this is new. What do we do with this? So, who are you going to ask? Everybody's on the leading edge. And I think you're right. Some careers, they don't exist yet. People watching this may find themselves in contexts where you're dealing with issues that are brand new to everyone. And so, where do you go? But I think at the same time, I did have a mentor at Microsoft, Ira Rubinstein, who I think is just a fantastic manager. And really, we went through some of those experiences together. And he was able to coach me based on his seniority and his experience at working through issues at the company. And so when we did privacy in the sense of human rights in China issues, operating in China, we were very much learning it together. But I was really appreciative of the fact that I had somebody who'd been through a number of other serious issues at the company before, and sometimes that institutional mentoring can be quite effective.
Yeah, I think you raise a really important point, Chuck, that a lot of the time, nobody knows what the answer is. And I think that's one of the reasons that I was in information security for a number of years before I transitioned into privacy. And one of the things that really attracted me was this kind of ambiguity. You mentioned that you have a philosophy background. My background's actually in physics. So I kind of came at things from the breaking down, problem solving kind of direction. And to me, working on some of these problems that nobody really knew the answer to was of particular interest. But I think for people who aren't necessarily in a Vodafone or a Microsoft, one of the things that I've experienced and I wanted to get your take on was, I find the privacy profession to be very collegial in terms of, because a lot of us, we are all in it together, we're working with some of these new challenges. I think there is a lot of, maybe not formal mentoring relationships, but certainly people are very willing to provide a perspective. And I think I would definitely encourage people who are on the call to, who are running into some of these things and maybe they don't have someone internal to turn to reach out and kind of try and see if people are talking about some of these issues. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I would say that certainly the industry is very, very collegial. One of the experiences that occurred when, again, we were dealing with, all right, how do we protect customer data and frankly, protect customers' lives when operating online services in China or other parts of the globe was, gosh, this is a sensitive area. We need to talk to our peer companies. And so I was probably the Microsoft employee with the most Google visitor stickers that had ever been acquired, because there were any number of my other colleagues who were trying to figure out how to stick it to Google, and we were trying to figure out how to work together.
That's interesting, yeah, especially given the competitive landscape at the time. Marc, from your perspective, are you seeing the same kind of things? Like, because I know that you'd worked at companies that maybe had smaller before obviously you moved to Facebook, where they have a lot of people in privacy, but you'd worked in smaller programs. Kind of how did you, from that kind of the mentoring or getting advice on things that maybe you hadn't run into before, how did that work for you?
For me, well, I did work at a fairly small company, but we had the resource backing of our parent company. And for me, that was always a good resource. Going back to the legal team, going back to the privacy team, and that sort of helped me sort of guide where I wanted StubHub to go. It was a good reference point, but it was always a square peg round hole. What sort of worked at the larger entity didn't necessarily fit properly in smaller companies. So, our technology stack was different. Our resources were different. We were more an agile company, so our development cycles didn't quite align. So it was sort of trying to find that fit, finding that balance to figure out what worked well for the company, what worked well with our product roadmaps, what worked well for leadership, and make sure that leadership understood where we were trying to go with this, since it was really all brand new. And then sort of take an aspect of knowing our data and sort of understanding how it flowed into the company, how do we retain it, how do we secure it. So it was really a branching point of privacy, technology, information security, and sort of just cobbling it all together to find something that worked in balance and worked well for the company.
Great. I just wanted to point out to the participants that if you do have any questions as kind of we're talking through, or you want us to go into a bit more detail, Chuck can tell you more about how great WAP firms were, and all of the memories that brought up for me as well when I trying to get one web page to load. I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of rookie mistakes, and in the interests of fairness here, I'll kind of I'll give you something that I really struggled with when I moved from information security more into privacy. And I think it really comes down for me to some of that additional nuance. One of the things with information security is that often there's very well structured and rigorous frameworks and standards, whether you're looking at PCI around credit cards, NIST 853, ISO 27001, there's a lot of pretty prescriptive guidance on how to build and operate security programs. Right? They don't cover everything, but they do cover a lot. When I moved into privacy, one of the things that I really did struggle with at the start was the amount of nuance that was present, and certainly the variation, the contextual nature of how privacy is. And really that needs to, rather than a lot of information security kind of happens on the back end, the back office of organizations, right? We don't want to tell people too much about how we do security in case you can find a way around it. Whereas one of the fundamental premises of privacy is really around transparency and letting people know what those things are that we're doing with their data, so that they can make informed decisions about it. So, Marc, when you came out of kind of that security / compliance background, did you kind of go through that similar transition as to trying to kind of almost get out of that security mindset and move into more of a privacy one? Or are there other things that you would look back on and say, well, that was a rookie mistake that I wouldn't, now that I have additional knowledge, I wouldn't do that again?
That's kind of an interesting question. What I was trying to do was try to apply some sort of framework and some sort of structure to how to get this privacy program off the ground. And I did have to leverage some of the security frameworks out there, just to make sure that I had some sort of path where I was going. I wouldn't call that a rookie mistake, but like you said, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of things that can be a lot of gray areas, and not a lot of things that can actually fit in a proper structure. at least in the early days going on. What I also found was, where I thought the end goal wasn't necessarily my end goal, because there's a lot of variations that could happen. There's a lot of changes to the roadmap and a lot of scope creep that I never really took into account. So it was sort of an interesting way of doing things. So like I said before, it's sort of a blend of the technology and the security and some of the compliance aspects, but applying it to something almost wholly new, at least from my perspective. So it was an interesting challenge.
And Chuck, same question to you. Like, are there things that you'd look back on that you may not have realized at the time, but in hindsight, you're like, well, that was something that was a rookie mistake, or something where you just didn't have the breadth of knowledge you do now to see the path forwards that now, would have been your chosen solution to something?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I think, like Marc, one of the things is understanding scope and what your desired end goal is, and how that looks. And sometimes, you can start out thinking, yeah, this is really important. We're going to build a whole program around this, and we're going to have this, quarterly check-in, and we're going to have this set of controls that we test regularly. And that's definitely appropriate for some things. But in other cases, somebody just wants to get the product out the door, and they just want a question answered. And so I think, being responsive to your clients, and just because, they want to build something that uses data doesn't mean that they're necessarily violating somebody's privacy, or that you need a fairly extensive compliance component around it. So I think one thing is there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to compliance. The other observation I'd make is, privacy is, as we all know as professionals, is populated with a fair number of gray areas. And everybody in this profession has applied something akin to that seems creepy test, which is not super precise. It's subjective necessarily. It's not rooted in written law or regulation or even industry codes of best practices. And so I think one rookie mistake is you can get yourself into a bit of analysis paralysis with that state of affairs, where, well, what's the right answer here? We better get user consent for that. And in a lot of cases, you should get user consent, or at least offer a notice and choice. But sometimes, offering those notice and choice experiences, they're there to protect the company, not to serve the consumer. Consumer doesn't need to be told about certain things. They don't need to be bothered with certain things. It just confuses them. You can risk, misleading people as to what's going on, which is exactly what you're trying not to do. So, it's another flavor of, it's not saying don't be overly conservative because privacy isn't serious. It's saying don't be overly conservative because certain solutions can be much more tailored than a sort of textbook privacy compliance audit kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And you just reminded me of one more mistake that I'd say that I made early on as well, is that I used to take all the complaints, because in some roles I was dealing with questions and complaints that came in from the public, and I used to take all of the complaints at face value when I started, and I think that kind of goes to what you were saying, that sometimes people just don't understand either what you're trying to do with their data or what the actual rules or requirements are. That they go to the law school of Google, and that they will cite chapter and verse to you, but not necessarily understand kind of how things work in practice. So I think that's another area where there's nuance, and really getting that blend where you don't reactively say, oh, we've got to go and change something because someone's complained about it. It's really doing that the analysis of what's the real story here, and is there any there? We've had a couple of questions come in from the audience as we've been talking, asking a little bit about kind of how do you get into privacy, we've talked about kind of some of our backgrounds, but also, do people need to be a lawyer to get into privacy, right? There are increasingly numbers of courses at universities where there's privacy law classes which weren't available a few years ago. There's also some movement towards additional certifications as well. So do either of you have any thoughts on kind of, do you have to be a lawyer, or kind of, I know that I'm not a lawyer, so maybe that answers the question. But how, when you're looking at staffing privacy programs, how do you think about what kind of skill sets do we need to get the job done?
If Marc wants to go first, that's great. I have a few thoughts on this though.
Sure, I can go first. I'm not a lawyer personally. I'm a tech guy. I have a background in, I have a master's in international business. My undergrad is in economics. So like I said, I don't really have a law degree at all. I took one business law class. That being said, I do have to interact with a lot of attorneys, and I do have to work well with the technical staff, engineering, and all of that. So from my perspective, you don't need to be a lawyer. You just need a legal partner to help distill a lot of the privacy nuances for you. So then you can distill it further into whatever your role is, whether it's the technical side, whether it's the third-party management side of things, and then start building your program that way. Sort of my take on it.
No, clearly, we've got two fantastic privacy pros right here with me on the panel. They don't, it's not required to be a lawyer, but I think the question really wasn't, do you need to be a lawyer, but it's assumed you need to be a lawyer, and what do we do about that? Just one other observation though, I'm a member of the privacy bar section within IAPP. We have a leadership group that helps create special resources for attorneys within the IAPP, which is to say, it's understood that IAPP is a network of privacy professionals writ large across the board, and some segment of it are lawyers. So it's, rather than it being all lawyers and some non-lawyers, it's actually as companies and privacy organizations resource for people, they are quite often looking for non-lawyers. In fact, T-Mobile is hiring at the moment for some privacy analyst and program management roles. So I think one of the things that you can do to change the perception for folks is to sort of reorient what a privacy program does. In some cases, yes, you need a privacy attorney so that incidents can be discussed under privilege. Supplier contracts and how your suppliers are handling data, super important. In terms of cross-border transfers, you have to have certain clauses, for example. So there's definitely functionalities that are important for lawyers, but implementing data governance as an IT professional is a super important privacy kind of role. Processing different initiatives through the impact assessments is a super important privacy role. And so one of the things I think you can do to change the perception is to identify, oh, here's the functions of a privacy program. And you'll see that in that exercise, there's a number of them that don't require, not only don't require a bar certification, but they don't necessarily require legal skill sets.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much in line with my experience as well. And I think one of the things that I tend to do a lot of is looking at almost organizational structure, and are privacy programs really delivering what they should be? And one of the first questions I ask is like, what are you trying to do? And then what skills do you need to actually get that done? And I would analogize as well to when I got into information security. At this point, I just say over 20 years ago, but over 20 years ago, there was very much that there wasn't the specialization there is today in the information security field. And I see that privacy is really, over the last 10 years, maybe longer, we've started to go down the same path where now, as Chuck said, maybe you'll have someone that just deals with instant response, or someone who deals with marketing privacy, or, kind of you may have a geographical focus. You may have more of a specialism around, one law or a set of laws. But I think that's an opportunity as well to really look at both for the people who are running programs, right? The privacy market is really hot right now. There are only so many, really qualified people who can do a number of things, but maybe your program doesn't need someone that's kind of that proverbial unicorn. If we can then actually define and separate those tasks out in a way that means that people are using the skills that they have, but they don't need to try and do, 5 different things to be effective in that role. So with that as well, you got Chuck, you mentioned the IAPP, and I wanted to circle back a little bit to that. So are you IAPP certified? And if you are, what was the draw for certification? If you're not, why did you not?
Yeah, no, the IAPP, International Association of Privacy Professionals, it's both, I think it's worth participating in it as a community, just as Aaron was wisely noting earlier, we tend to be very collaborative across organizations and even across perspectives as privacy pros. We talk a common language. And the certification, I think, frankly, some, if not most employers expect or at least encourage a certification. Secondly, it helps solidify someone's identity as a privacy professional. It establishes you have a baseline level of knowledge about the things required for any number of different privacy roles. And so I think, if employers generally didn't require it, then yeah, I might have opted to some more informal way of gaining some of that knowledge. But even then, gosh, there's a value in being able to have some currency attached to your resume and CV that says, yeah, you can trust that I'm a privacy knowledgeable person because this trustworthy organization has given me the certification. And I think that's the other kind of thing is, anytime you're hiring, it's, well, who is this person and what can they do? And is this the right fit for the role and the tasks that I need done? It's talking to people's references and so forth can be helpful, but this is a real quick shorthand way of saying, yep, I've got the basics down.
Thanks, Chuck. And Marc, what about you? Did you get certified at some point along your journey?
Yeah, I have this incredible way of pushing things out till the end. So I'm still working on my CIPT. Actually, I just need to schedule that date. But yes, it is. I've taken a number of courses through the IAPP, US, CIPP, US and E, CIPM, and CIPT. I just need to take those tests. But like I said, Chuck said, it does provide a solid foundation for where you can build on your career. It's always good on a resume, and it's sort of a way of saying, I'm a privacy professional. I've done X, Y, and Z. And it sort of like nails things down based on the experience that you've had. So it ties up, it's like tying a nice bow around your career. Let's just say.
Yeah, and for me, I moved to the States in 2006, and I took my CIPP US in 2007 because, as we talked earlier, privacy is very contextual. I didn't really know the US laws very well because I hadn't been living here. So for me, that was kind of an immersion class almost in just how complicated the US system is compared to Australia, where I was living previously. So yeah, I think from the perspective of are certifications helpful? Absolutely, but I would, Marc rattled off a few different certifications, and I think it's definitely worth looking, what are you trying to achieve with a certification? Is it really about getting more knowledge? Is it, as Chuck was saying, kind of, more for kind of looking good on the resume, giving that minimum level of qualification, or a combination of both? So I wouldn't necessarily, and I don't suggest, I'm on the training faculty for the IAPP. I teach a lot of the certifications, and when people come to me and say, which one should I get first? My answer is usually, well, what's your job? What is your job, or what do you want your job to be? And then I can give you more advice kind of on, should you start with something that's more technical like the CIPT, or something that maybe, like me, fills in a gap in my knowledge, which was the US legal framework and a lot of those laws that influence what we can and can't do. So I think with that,
there was a question here about the CIPM. And does it have value in the marketplace? And I thought I'd just address that quickly by saying I am only a CIPP US certification for just the reasons that Aaron noted, which is, in 9 years at T-Mobile, our international data privacy exposure is fairly modest. In fact, it really only began after the Sprint acquisition. So it hasn't been professionally necessary to go expanding into outside of that core certification. CAPM, similarly, I think it's probably a lot more of value add in terms of the knowledge that you can gain through that certification than necessarily as a credential. So it has value, just has maybe a little different value than the core certification does.
Great, we've got a few minutes left, and I have two more questions that I'd like to ask both of you. The first one is, we talked a little bit before about how privacy is very broad in that personal information in most organizations touches pretty much all of the organization. So you're often in a position where, Chuck, you mentioned earlier, kind of there's a lot of ambiguity where we don't even as a profession necessarily know what the right answer is when some new requirement comes out. How do you manage that ambiguity combined with the need to influence other people, right? We've got to go to the IT department and say, we need to implement this for GDPR, but we don't really know what this is yet. How do you deal with those kind of scenarios?
I'll go first. I think when you deal with those kind of ambiguities, I think one of the things that's where there is a value for a lawyer's skill set who is experienced at reading legislation and coming up with interpretations of that are both, honor the text, take into account the intent of the legislation, but also read the words with meanings that you can assign that advantage your client or your business. And so there's a bit of the persuasion comes from saying, okay, I'm going to help you understand what these words mean. Particularly for legislation that may have been, let's say, written in haste due to a ballot initiative, not to pick on anyone in particular, there could be a bit of an Alice in Wonderland where words mean whatever I say they mean. Or words don't have the fixed meaning that gives us that great deal of comfort level. So then one of the next tips I think that pros can do is think about, okay, how would I do this practically? This is where tech guys like Marc can be incredibly invaluable, which is, okay, we could build a system to do this, but we're doing that, needle in a haystack. And so just using those practical ways of saying, okay, I can implement something that maps this, but not that. That's a way of generating a consensus around how you're going to go forward in implementing these new kind of laws.
Yeah, I agree there. Ambiguity is really part of the game. Lean on some of your partners, your legal partners, for the interpretation of what it may or may what the legislation says. And then lean on your technology staff and your product teams and sort of build towards that goal. And learn to move fast and be agile and learn to adapt, because things can change. Things pivot, legislation change or is updated. But embrace the ambiguity. See a goal, see the finish line, but be prepared to sort of adjust as you move along your roadmaps, and be sure to understand some of the technology and sort of make sure that there's buy-in at all levels of the business to make sure that you are actually going down the right path. But don't be scared of it at all. It's just part of the game.
Yeah, I think that's critically important, that stakeholder management piece, and particularly kind of, we've heard from two different angles there that Chuck's saying that we need to interpret the law, we need to work out what the law really means. But from a technical perspective, often that can be very challenging to actually then, how do we build something that crawls 1,000 systems and finds out where all of Marc's information is, for example. Right? Some of these are, even if you are looking at the law and saying, well, I know, guys, that's actually what it says, that those can be very substantial projects with a lot of impact. So I think one of the things that I've learned kind of about the profession is that outside of, internal audit and maybe a couple of other roles, privacy will give you one of the broadest views across organizations, different groups of stakeholders. And I think I keep coming back to that as being one of the things that keeps it interesting for me, is that there are always other groups of people that we can be engaging with to kind of work through some of these thorny issues. So I wanted to kind of move towards, any additional questions, but and maybe Marc, start with you. What do you think is the biggest lesson that you've learned about yourself, or kind of the any final tips that you could give the audience around, either getting started or kind of moving across from compliance as you did, or how will people take away and kind of move forwards after listening to this presentation?
For me, what I found is that there's a lot of different dimensions in privacy, and it sort of overlaps with any sort of career out there. Myself having an econ background, compliance, information security, and there's lots of places where you can find your niche and where you can succeed. So there's a lot of variations in educational background and careers, and just find something in privacy that fits your style, the way you want to work, the way you want to interact with your stakeholders, with individuals, and move forward with it.
What about you, Chuck? Any kind of takeaways, or these are the things that you want people to kind of be thinking about, after the call is over?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a couple of questions in the chat that I think have a common theme, which is, how do we generate influence? How do we bridge understanding between legal and technical folks? Writ large, sort of the word people and the numbers people, if you will. And how do you do that influencing in an area where, as we've discussed, there's a bit of ambiguity even in the laws as written. And so I have two sort of pieces of advice for that. One is that I think there's a great value in trying to define these things as a way in a way that's kind of the jigsaw puzzle method, where you actually start with a picture of what you want it to look like, and then try and assemble it. Any number of projects can work well when you start with the pieces and say, oh, I wonder what this is going to look like when we're done. But a lot of times a privacy or a privacy impact assessment process, or a contract supply chain review process, you need to start with the vision, and then work towards that. And certainly you'll iterate and revise as you go. But just like a jigsaw puzzle, if you've got the picture on the box to go towards, that's a very helpful mental tool. The other is, I think, any number of Harvard Business Review articles and professional training courses on what folks call emotional intelligence. How do you manage your emotions? How do you understand, to take the clues that your emotions are giving you and use them effectively? But how do you avoid, interpersonal tensions or, misunderstandings? That kind of emotional intelligence work is very helpful, particularly not only in privacy, but in data security, where sometimes the standards are equally vague, right? Any number of lawyers will tell you the law requires that we have reasonable safeguards, and reasonable safeguards are safeguards appropriate to the sensitivity of the data and the nature of the business. That's kind of what some laws actually say. And I've attended professional ethics training where they say, you have to be very careful in advising your client as to whether a data security set of controls is legally compliant, because in truth, you may not know until you have a data breach and the regulator comes to investigate them. And in the case of a data breach, something failed. You may have been, investing in state-of-the-art security, but yet there was still something more you could have done. There's always something more you could have done. Those kind of contexts can create a bit of emotional tension from people, because that level of uncertainty can be unnerving. And if you're the person with the emotional intelligence to stay calm in that storm, you stand a really good chance of success.
And we've got a couple of questions coming in if you guys have another couple of minutes to answer them. A question from Paul around looking at privacy management software. So we've seen an explosion over the last couple of years. I think, when GDPR was first it formalized in 2016 before it came into effect in 2018. There's really been a market explosion of technology solutions to help privacy professionals. Do either of you have either good or bad experiences or advice for people that are looking at, how much should I trust these things or use them as part of my program?
I guess I can go first. So back at StubHub, we had a way of looking at almost every tool under the sun. And that was just part of the culture. That being said, we never really found a tool that would do everything that we needed. So for us, it was about customizing solutions in-house to where we could get it to where we wanted our solutions to be. And that was just a couple years ago. I'm not sure where these types of software programs out there have matured to date. My current company is largely builds everything in-house because we have such a customized tool set, customized technology. So everything we build is in-house to meet our specifications. So generally it's a lot more robust in some ways. It's a lot more overhead for us, but we get the exact technology that we want and what we need to give us our data insights. So that's sort of been my experience. It's not necessarily probably what you're looking for, but just my last two companies, it's just sort of where we needed to go and how we wanted to access our data and our understanding of it.
Yeah, I think that the question is, what are the trends in that area and what's the value in becoming fluent in privacy management software? I have three quick thoughts. One is there's a lot of value in it because the tasks that privacy law is asking of us now are enterprise data governance tasks. And so you need some fluency in that for sure. And second is, I think there's probably to Marc's point, value in becoming fluent in privacy management software generally. If you're certified on one particular tool or deep knowledge on one particular tool, and then either your employer opts to use a different tool or your next employer has a different tool or it has their own in-house tools, then there can be a little bit of money left on the table in investing in one particular tool. And vendors should be there to support you so that you don't have to be a deep expert on any given tool. But general expertise, I do think is very valuable. And I think the trend is towards more use of these tools. Somebody, may be asking like, where do I look for roles in privacy? I think one flip answer is look for firms and organizations that use data. Right? And so all of them are going to need to some extent some privacy management software, some larger and some smaller. So it's definitely a trend. And then the third is, I think, and a general observation about technology, as a musician, there's all sorts of effects out there. Everybody's heard the gated reverb sound on Phil Collins drums, and it became ubiquitous. It was a really cool innovation. It was a really cool tool, and then it got overused. And so I think, there's a tendency for people to say, hey, turn on this software and then you're good. And you want to be thoughtful about not over relying on software and not overusing it.
Yeah, I mean, I would see software like any other tool, right? It certainly can help if you understand what you're doing with it. But I wouldn't go and buy a chainsaw and just start chopping down trees. That's probably going to result in some unforeseen consequences. So I think that it's really, what we advise that the companies that I work with is get a really good set of requirements about what you want this thing to do, and then go out and see what's out there that meets them rather than the other way around. Don't let somebody tell you that their tool is the answer to all of your problems. Really get a good sense of what you want first, and then see what best matches. I think that's good advice, not just with privacy tools, but with other things we're trying to do as well. Like make sure that we have a good understanding of what we want to do, and then see how we can get there. I know we had some additional questions coming in. I know that we're pretty much at the time that we said we would take for this. Karen did put her email into the chat if there are questions that we didn't get to that you'd like the panelists to answer. I think Marc and Chuck, if you're both fine with if there are additional questions, we can kind of support those after the session as well.
Absolutely.
You bet.
Great. Well, I hope this has been useful for everyone. I think that the overall answer is that there are lots of paths to privacy. There's lots of adjacencies, as you heard from the panelists around, how they got into the profession. Lots of people don't necessarily start in privacy, but with the market kind of growing and diversifying, there's lots of opportunities for people with coding skills, legal skills, project management skills, lots of different ways that you can get involved in some of these areas. And I think maybe I'll leave it with paraphrasing Chuck's quote that if you want a job in privacy, find a company that uses personal data, because that's really where, almost every organization these days is a data organization. And I think that's where looking at the opportunities, not just today, but kind of where organizations, how are they talking about data being part of their strategy? That can help you find those opportunities that may not be, immediately obvious. But I would say from experience that pretty much every organization has some concerns. It just depends on kind of how aligned that data is with their overall strategy. So with that, thanks everyone for attending. Particular thanks to Marc and Chuck for taking time out of their busy schedules. And as I said, if you have any other questions that we didn't get to, we will be happy to answer those after the session. So with that, thanks very much again, and hope you all have a good rest of the day.